All right, well, welcome back, guys. It's Clayton, and welcome to Fly with Clayton. We're going to be talking about another CFI training lesson today. We're going to be going through Area Operations 2, Task A, Aeromedical Factors. Very important section for us to go through. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. All right, so you might be wondering, why do I, as a pilot, need to understand medical factors? You might be saying, I'm a pilot, I'm flying planes. Why does this happen? Why does this matter? Well, it's important because if you or a passenger are experiencing a medical incident or something like that, we want to make sure we can take the proper precautions and proper procedures in order to not harm or physically cause more damage to someone who is going through something, a medical incident or something like that. We need to be able to identify it, recognize the symptoms, and how to properly correct for that and prevent any further damage. So that's why it's important for us to understand different medical symptoms or factors that you might experience while flying. So let's first talk about what you as a pilot will need in order to be able to fly with medical. So the FAA has a couple different ways that you are able to fly under medical. The first one is just through the medical classes. There are 3 medical classes in terms of like most, I don't want to say restrictive, but like top notch in order to just basic. So the basic bottom one is 3rd class medical, 2nd class, 1st class. So 3rd class is what you bare bones minimum need to fly as a private pilot. And if you are under 40, then this 3rd class medical, once you get it, is good for 60 calendar months. If you want to go ahead and get a 2nd class medical, which is required for commercial operations, then that is good for 12 calendar months if you're under 40. Also, if you want to go ahead and get a 1st class medical, maybe you just want to make sure you can apply for that and actually get it. If you're under 40, again, it's good for 12 calendar months. Now, if you are over 40, the 3rd class is only good for 24 calendar months. The 2nd class is only good for 12 as well, but 1st class is only good for 6 months. And whenever, let's say I have a private pilot or a student who's coming to me and he is 16, he gets a 1st class medical. After a year, after 12 calendar months, that 1st class medical then starts to act as a 3rd class medical because it's run its course as a 1st. It then turns into essentially a 3rd class. It's just a 1st class acting as a 3rd class. So it'll last another 4 years, 48 calendar months. So it'll fill out that whole 60 calendar duration of a 3rd class medical, but just that first 12 acts as a 1st class medical, if that makes sense. So just real briefly, I won't touch too much into this, but if we had a new student come in and they wanted to get a medical and they had no idea how, first thing they need to do is they need to go to medexpress.com, or not .com, just the website MedExpress. It's FAA.gov, can also find you an AME, an Aeromedical examiner, who can conduct that exam. Once they go to MedExpress, they'll fill out a form, and once they get that form, it'll give them like a confirmation code. They'll take that to that AME that they found, and they'll get a medical exam, and then the AME will sign them off and give them their medical. So that's how you get the medical. You can, once you've gotten a medical, you can operate under basic med. I'm not going to go too much in basic med today, but just know it's a very bare bones minimum way for you to operate under without a full medical, but it allows you to have just your driver's license. But there are some restrictions on how you can use it, such as like the size of the aircraft, the number of passengers you can take, also how high you can go and how fast you can go. We're not going to go too much in depth that today because I want to talk more about these actual medical factors as opposed to just the stuff on how to get medicals. We could talk about that in another lesson. Let's go ahead and talk about some different aeromedical factors you might see while flying. The first one is hypoxia. Now, there's a couple different types of hypoxia. We'll go through all 4 of them, but just in general, hypoxia just means reduced oxygen. So maybe you as a pilot don't have enough oxygen, the oxygen levels are reduced in your body. Hypoxia means you're just not getting enough oxygen that you need to sustain. So it can be caused by a couple different things, and each type we'll go through. We'll get more specific, but just an insufficient supply of oxygen is one. Inadequate transportation of oxygen in your blood, or even just the inability for your body to use the oxygen, for your body tissues to use the oxygen in your body. So let's first talk about hypoxic hypoxia. This is kind of the basic model, or the very first essential, like just bare bones hypoxia. It's just a result of insufficient oxygen available to the lungs. So maybe it's a blocked airway, maybe like you're drowning or something like that. But for pilots, this is just could be due to high altitude. The higher we go in altitude, the less concentration of oxygen we have in the air. So higher we go, less oxygen, we run the risk of hypoxia. So just that's the kind of bare bones, bare minimum, not minimum, but simplest form of hypoxia. And again, that just comes from high altitude. An easy symptom for that, or I don't want to say symptom, easy way to correct for that is descend, go to lower altitude. It's important to know also, we're not talking about night operations, but do know that in nighttime flying, altitude as low as 5,000 feet can affect your oxygen. It can cause hypoxia in nighttime flight. And we'll talk a little bit, we could talk about altitudes and oxygen requirements. Another lesson we might touch a little bit on here, but let's just keep going. We'll talk about hypemic hypoxia. This is when it occurs when the blood is not able to transport oxygen or sufficient oxygen to the cells in the body. So this might be caused by you giving blood or something like that, maybe just not sufficient blood levels in your body. So blood diseases can also cause this as well. And also carbon monoxide poisoning can also cause this. So careful, make sure you're not having engine exhaust coming into your cockpit because that could cause some hypemic hypoxia. Stagnant hypoxia is just oxygen-rich blood in the lungs isn't moving to the tissue. So the easiest and simplest way that you might be familiar with this is if you ever had your arm or your leg fall asleep. Have you ever fell asleep on your arm and then you wake up and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't feel it. It looked like flops all over the place. It feels really weird. It's a perfect example of stagnant hypoxia. Oxygen's just not flowing through the tissue or to get to your tissue or moving to the tissue, and it kind of makes you feel like, can't feel it. It can result from shock, heart failing to pump blood effectively, or constrained artery. In that case, that's a constrained artery for whenever your arm or your leg falls asleep. And then finally, histotoxic hypoxia is the final one. And histotoxic, toxic being toxic. So you can kind of remember that one. Histo refers to tissue or cells. So this comes from toxic, the oxygen being toxic to your blood. So could be caused by alcohol, drugs, or anything like that, narcotics, or even just poison. So, of course, with that, simple solution is don't drink or take drugs that can cause stuff like that. Some symptoms of hypoxia. How can we recognize this? The first one is everything will, if it's for you yourself, you'll start to feel a headache. Maybe things will start to get blurry. You'll feel like a euphoria feeling. Your fingertips will start to kind of tingle, and maybe your lips will turn blue. Those are some kind of common symptoms we see with hypoxia. You'll feel lightheaded, drowsy, all those kind of things. And we talked about the important thing is if you experience this in flight, the quickest and easiest thing you can do is just descend in altitude. More than likely, you're not going to have supplemental oxygen on a training aircraft, but if you do, that is one thing that you can actually use supplemental oxygen and get more oxygen in your body. But the simplest way for us training is just descend in altitude, get to lower altitude. We won't go too much into oxygen requirements because that's more of an instrument training thing you need, but just know that at 12,500 up to 14,000 feet, oxygen is required after you have been at that altitude for more than 30 minutes. Above 14,000 feet, that's when the required crew of a flight is required to use oxygen for the duration. It's above that altitude. And then once we hit 15,000 feet, then everyone on the flight has to be provided supplemental oxygen. Of course, if you have a pressurized aircraft, that also helps in that, nullifies all of that. Again, not going to touch too much in depth on this, but a good thing to know. Something we can also talk about is TUC, time of useful consciousness. Basically, the higher you go in altitude, because there's less oxygen in the air, that means your time to react and process information gets so much shorter because it's so much higher and there's less oxygen concentration in the air. So for example, these are some pretty interesting statistics about this. If you're at an altitude of 20,000 feet and you lose oxygen, you only have 30 minutes or more until you're no longer conscious. But check this out. Once we get up to 30,000 feet, that drops to only a minute to 2 minutes before you lose consciousness. If you're flying at flight level 400, 40,000 feet, you only have 15 to 20 seconds before you lose consciousness. So that's why on flights, if you ever flown on an airline, they always tell you put your own mask on before helping others, because that time of useful consciousness is so important. So that's time of useful consciousness. And we talked about treatment there with hypoxia. Let's talk about hyperventilation. This is an excessive loss of carbon dioxide from the body, which can lead to unconsciousness while the respiratory system attempts to override your actions and regain control of your breathing. So this is kind of whenever you're breathing too quickly and carbon dioxide is excessively coming out of your body more than it needs to. So common symptoms of this is just visual impairment. You might become unconscious. We just talked about that. get lightheaded, dizzy, tingling sensation again. So we want to make sure there's kind of some similarities in the symptoms there. We don't want to misdiagnose between hypoxia and hyperventilation. It can also feel like a hot or cold sensation. You might even have muscle spasms. And finally, the treatment with that is we want to just slow our breathing rate. This can come from just being anxious while we're flying. So we want to make sure we calm down, just normalize our breathing rate. And ways we can do that is read out loud. Maybe take a checklist and read out loud. Force yourself to calm down and think about what you're reading, or even just forcing yourself to breathe normally. Maybe even just taking a paper bag and breathing in and out of that might help as well. So just really just calming down and normalizing your breathing rate is the quickest and most effective way to do that. Middle ear and sinus problems. This is important, especially for us down here in the South in spring, because, pollen and allergies can cause some real issues while flying. I know I definitely suffer from allergy issues, so this is something I need to be extra conscious of. Basically, there's a difference between the pressure in the outside air and the inside ear of the middle ear and the nasal sinuses, and it can cause some real discomfort while you're flying. Ooh, almost lost contact there. It can cause a lot of pain. It can cause discomfort, and it can really just make you, speaking of discomfort, I try not to lose this contact. Excuse me. All right, so it can, like I said, it can cause some discomfort and pain, but in relation to climbing, whenever you're climbing, if you have middle ear problems, it can cause pressure to build up inside your ear, and it can be extremely painful while you're climbing, maybe even cause ruptured eardrums and stuff like that. So we want to make sure you don't have any middle ear problems or sinus problems while we're, before we're going flying. That's the quickest and easiest way to prevent it. But also, if you do experience it, try chewing gum or like stretching your jaw, because it can actually open up that airway in your ear and kind of alleviate some of that pressure. And that's kind of the easiest way to do that. And then kind of with the sinus problems, just being stuffy and all stuffed up, again, it can cause you not to think well. It can cause pain in your sinus areas, and can just build up a lot of mucus inside. It's just not a great experience to be flying, and you don't want to be flying while you're sick. So, of course, if you feel this before you go flying, just don't go flying. But if you do experience it in air, try to maybe slow your descent rate so you're not descending or ascending too quickly, causing drastic changes in pressure. And of course, just like we said, don't fly whenever you're having these types of sinus problems. Spatial disorientation. This is a big one that has caused many accidents in aviation. It's basically you lose your orientation feeling inside your body, so you can't tell what altitude, what orientation of like the way your plane is angled or movement in airspace is. So whenever you lose visual cues, maybe you fly into a cloud or something like that, you lose your visual cues of how your body is positioned in space. It can get you into a very dangerous situation where you don't realize what your plane is doing. So that's why it's actually important we as pilots, even during private pilot training, we do some instrument training. We get those 3 hours of instrument time so we can understand and how to properly read the instruments if we do get into a situation like that. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because, one, it's super complicated, but just to explain so you kind of have an understanding of how it works. The vestibular system that's your motion sensing system inside your body of how you determine your orientation. Basically, there's a fluid inside your ear, and if you, let's say I just slowly bank into a turn over time, it's just a very gradual change, but if the fluid in your ear is able to settle, that's going to become your new orientation. If you're crooked like this for long enough and it settles long enough, your body is mentally going to think you are in level, even though my head is truly tilted. So that's what can cause the spatial disorientation. So kind of prevention with that is we want to rely on our instruments. Don't get caught into a situation where where you're spatially disoriented, but rely and trust your instruments. And that's why we do that instrument training, even if it's just 3 hours for our private pilot's license. Motion sickness, I've unfortunately found myself guilty of this or susceptible to this. Basically, you get motion sick whenever the plane's moving. We're all familiar with getting car sick or something like that. So treatment of this is kind of the big thing a lot of people don't understand. Open the window if you can. If you've got a little hatch for the window, open it, get some fresh air coming in. And the big thing is focus on fixed objects outside the aircraft. Don't be looking at your instruments or inside the aircraft if you can. Focus on fixed objects outside the aircraft, and that will really help settle things down. There are some other ways people have tried taking, I think ginger is a good recommendation for helping with motion sickness or something like that. But I would definitely maybe talk with an AME or something like that. If that's something you're experiencing a ton, it can be taught to overcome. Like if you experience it a lot, you can train your body to overcome it. but it does take a little bit of time. So maybe talk with an AME if they have any recommendations on how to properly navigate through motion sickness. I'm going to make sure my recording's not stopping here. We're still going. We're good. Carbon monoxide poisoning, we talked about how that can play into hypoxia. It's a colorless and smellless odor. True carbon monoxide is odorless. So it can really cause poisoning. It can cause you to have a headache, blurred vision, dizziness, and all that kind of stuff. And the big thing that this comes from with flying is that engine exhaust leaking into the cockpit. Sometimes you can't smell it, and it can become very deadly, very fatal. It can really impair how your decision making is. So if you can, I'd strongly recommend you get some form of carbon monoxide detector. If you have a Sentry for ForeFlight, that will actually detect carbon monoxide, which is awesome. Or even just a little placard thing that changes color when there's carbon monoxide detected. Get some form of something that can detect it whenever there is carbon monoxide. And of course, if you do detect it, first thing you want to do is open those windows, get some fresh air inside, and get down. Maybe use some supplemental oxygen if you have it, but land and get out of the plane if you can, quick as possible. Fatigue and stress. We're all familiar with stress and fatigue and how that can affect our bodies. When we get stressed, it can become a hard environment for us to concentrate and think. So, and we talked, I think, in other lessons about how there's two types of stress and fatigue: acute and chronic. Acute being more of that short term, like I didn't sleep well last night. Chronic is more of I haven't slept well in months. So again, this can cause some different things, just physical stress on your body, sustained psychological stress, and it can impair your decision making and stuff like that. So prevention really is, we want to make sure we're having a proper diet and treating ourselves well, getting good exercise. That's more for like acute fatigue. But if you're having more chronic stress and fatigue, maybe that's something you want to talk with your doctor about and how you can properly navigate that. But we definitely don't want to be flying while we're fatigued or stressed, because that can affect how, like I said, our decision making, our impairment. They can impair our judgment while we're flying. So of course, we want to try to navigate that and alleviate that as much as possible. Dehydration, pretty simple. Want to make sure we got plenty of water, but when you do get up in the air, especially if it's in the summertime, you can get dry pretty quickly. So make sure you're just drinking plenty of water with that. It can cause different things like you feel nauseous and stuff like that. So the very simple solution is bring plenty of water and drink plenty of water while you're flying if you can. I'd recommend my students bring like a little bottled water with them, just so if they get thirsty or if they start to feel dehydrated in the air, they can quickly just drink some water, help them out. Alcohol and drugs. We all are familiar again with our alcohol requirements and drug requirements with the FAA. 8 hours from bottle to throttle. Shouldn't be flying if you've been drinking in the past 8 hours. But also the caveat with this is even after 8 hours, you could still be under the influence of alcohol. So make sure that we don't have any alcohol in our system, or we're not under the influence of alcohol. The legal limit is 0.04. But again, make sure you're not under the influence of alcohol at all. And that's straight from the FAR, it's 9117. So make sure you're not under the influence with alcohol. Medication and drugs. Make sure you're only taking medication that's approved by the FAA or your AME, because they can absolutely affect a pilot's performance. Don't take anything if it's not approved. And as always, just consult your AME if you got questions and what's allowed. The FAA also has a list of stuff that is approved on their website, so you can consult that as well, just to make sure you're taking everything that you need to, but also not taking what you're not supposed to. And then finally, let's talk about nitrogen scuba diving. This is probably one a lot of people don't think about, but something you want to consider. Maybe your student went scuba diving the day before, and basically, when you go scuba diving, this results in an increase in amount of nitrogen dissolved in your body. And the deeper the dive, the greater the nitrogen in your body is. Well, at sea level, the nitrogen inside and outside the body is at equilibrium. But when you go deeper, when atmospheric pressure is reduced, the equilibrium is upset, and that nitrogen leaves the body. Well, if it leaves your body too quickly, bubbles may form, and this can cause such a variety of symptoms. It can be extremely painful. We call this the bends. That's what they call it. And it can, in extreme cases, actually result in death. So how do we kind of navigate through this? It's very simple. If you know a student has been scuba diving, or maybe you think they might be scuba diving, just ask them, have you been scuba diving? You want to wait at least 12 hours after you go scuba diving if there has not been a controlled descent, or after a dive not requiring a controlled descent before flying up to 8,000 feet. But it's probably even better just wait 24 hours for flights above 8,000 feet. Ask them also how many safety stops did they have to make on there scuba dive. If they had to make more safety stops for how deep they went, that can affect how much longer they need to wait. So be very careful with that because it can be a very painful experience. And like I said, it can also result in death. So we want to make sure we're being cautious about nitrogen and scuba diving and not causing them discomfort or potentially death. And then finally, well, I say finally, just one more final thing we can talk about with aeromedical things is the I'm safe checklist. It's a great way to kind of go through and make sure you as a pilot are safe to fly. They got that illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and emotion. Going through that checklist and making sure you are A-okay to fly. And that's a great way to determine if you should be up in the air or on the ground. So that's aeromedical factors. You know, we kind of talked about there's many different factors pilots needs to be aware of in order to be safe, but also make sure our passengers are not in discomfort while we're flying as well. So it's very important we understand those, able to recognize them, and navigate and do what we need to do to help alleviate some of those aeromedical conditions. So cool. That is aeromedical factors. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode talking about that. My check ride has technically, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about my check ride at one point. That's going to be another video, but I'm not going to stop making these videos even after my check ride. So we'll navigate through that and continue to make videos. If you guys have recommendations of more lessons you'd like to see me teach through, be sure to leave them in the comments below and we'll put those up if we can. But thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.